Stop scrolling. I need 20 minutes. Here's a question you've probably never once asked yourself. Why don't you eat lion, or wolf, or tiger, or bear, or shark? Think about it. Humans eat almost everything. Cow, pig, chicken, fish, insects in some places, snails, snakes, even fermented shark in Iceland if you're brave enough. We eat weird stuff. We eat gross stuff. We eat things that should probably kill us. But across nearly every culture on Earth, going back tens of thousands of years, there's one category of animal almost nobody regularly ate. Predators, apex hunters, the things at the very top of the food chain. And here's the part that should genuinely stop. Ancient humans figured this out with zero biology classes, zero lab equipment, zero understanding of toxicology, no microscopes, no science journal, just instinct, observation, and a whole lot of trial and error that occasionally ended in someone's death. Tonight we're finding out exactly how they knew. And the answer involves poison liver, parasites, sacred animals, and one very specific reason your body genuinely cannot handle eating another predator's meat too often. Buckle up. This one gets dark fast. Let's start with the obvious question. Why would this even be a rule? If you're starving and a lion is dead in front of you, why would ancient humans just walk away from free protein? Turns out they didn't always walk away. But when they did eat predator meat, something strange kept happening across completely unrelated cultures, thousands of miles apart, who had zero contact with each other. They all arrived at eerily similar warnings. Don't eat the liver. Don't eat it too often. Don't eat certain parts at all. That's not a coincidence. That's convergent discovery. Different groups of humans on different continents, independently running the same deadly experiment and landing on the same conclusion. So let's actually understand why, because the biology here is wild. Start with something called the trophic pyramid. Basically, every ecosystem is a chain. Plants absorb sunlight and nutrients from soil. Herbivores eat plants. Predators eat herbivores. Energy moves up that chain level by level. But here's the thing nobody tells you about that chain. Toxins move up it too. And they don't just move up, they concentrate as they climb. This is called bioaccumulation, and it's one of the sneakiest processes in nature. If a plant absorbs a tiny trace of a heavy metal or toxin from soil, a herbivore that eats a huge volume of that plant accumulates a slightly bigger dose in its own tissue. Then, a predator that eats many herbivores over its lifetime accumulates an even bigger dose than any single herbivore had. By the time you're eating the animal at the very top of the food chain, you're essentially eating a concentrated summary of everything toxic that entire ecosystem produced. A polar bear isn't just a polar bear. It's basically a walking archive of every trace toxin in every seal it ever ate. Ancient humans didn't know the word bioaccumulation, but they absolutely knew the pattern. Eat this animal, get sick. Eat that one, don't. Now let's talk about the single most famous example of this in the entire historical record, because it's almost unbelievable. Polar bear liver. Arctic peoples going back thousands of years developed an extremely specific and extremely consistent rule. Never eat polar bear liver. Not a little. Not ever. And they were completely right to ban it, for a reason modern science only fully explained in the 20th century. Polar bear liver contains absolutely massive concentrations of vitamin A. We're talking levels so high that eating even a small piece can cause acute vitamin A poisoning in a human being. Symptoms include severe headaches, dizziness, vomiting, peeling skin, and in serious cases, it can be fatal. Why does polar bear liver have so much vitamin A? Because polar bears eat seals. Seals eat fish. Fish eat smaller fish and plankton. And vitamin A, specifically, accumulates heavily in liver tissue at every single step of that chain. By the time you reach a polar bear, sitting at the very top, its liver has concentrated an almost toxic dose. Here's the part that should genuinely blow your mind. Arctic communities figured this out with zero chemistry. No lab could tell them this is vitamin A toxicity. All they had was generations of people getting violently sick or dying after eating this one specific organ from this one specific animal. And they turned that pattern into an absolute unbreakable rule passed down for centuries that outsiders later confirmed with modern science was precisely correct. That's not superstition, that's applied epidemiology, running purely on observation and memory, centuries before anyone had a microscope. And polar bear liver isn't a one-off case. Sled dogs that accidentally ate polar bear liver got sick too. Even early European explorers who ignored local Arctic warnings and ate it themselves documented brutal, sometimes near-fatal poisoning episodes. The rule wasn't cultural preference, it was survival knowledge, hard-earned, and completely validated centuries later. So that's reason number one predator meat got avoided. Concentrated toxin, but it's not the only reason, and honestly, it might not even be the biggest one. Let's talk about parasites, because this is where things get genuinely unsettled. Predator animals don't just accumulate toxins from their prey, they accumulate parasites too. Specifically, a nasty one called trichotillomania the parasite responsible for trichinosis. Trichinosis spreads through undercooked meat, and it's especially common in carnivorous and omnivorous animals because those parasites move up the food chain the exact same way toxins do. A predator that's been eating infected prey for years can carry an enormous parasitic load in its own muscle tissue. Eat that meat undercooked, and those parasites move straight into you. Left untreated, trichinosis can cause muscle pain, fever, swelling, and in severe cases, heart and lung complications serious enough to kill. Ancient humans obviously had no concept of microscopic parasite, but once again, they had something almost as powerful: pattern recognition across generations. Eat this specific kind of meat, undercooked, and people get sick with a very particular, very recognizable set of symptoms. Do it enough times, across enough generations, and a culture eventually just stops doing it. Not because anyone explained the biology, because the pattern became undeniable. This is honestly one of the most underrated forms of ancient science. No one wrote a research paper, no one ran a controlled experiment, but entire communities functioned as multi-generational, real-world trial and error labs, quietly compiling data through nothing but memory and consequence. And this isn't just a land animal problem either. The exact same bioaccumulation and parasite logic applies underwater, and it's worth a quick detour because it shows just how universal this pattern really is. Large ocean predators, think sharks, big tuna, swordfish, sit at the very top of marine food chains the same way lions and bears sit at the top of land food chain. And they accumulate mercury and other heavy metals in their tissue for exactly the same reason polar bears accumulate vitamin A. Small fish absorb trace metals from the water, slightly bigger fish eat lots of small fish, and apex predator fish eat lots of those bigger fish over years, sometimes decades. Modern health guidelines today still specifically warn pregnant women to limit consumption of shark, swordfish, and other large predator fish because of exactly this mercury concentration effect. That's not an ancient superstition. That's a current, active government health warning running on the same basic principle coastal communities were instinctively working around for thousands of years before anyone knew what mercury even was. Coastal and island communities across history often developed their own specific taboos around eating certain large predatory fish too frequently, or eating them at all during certain life stages like pregnancy. They didn't have blood tests. They had generations of watching who got sick and when, and building a rule around it. Same pattern, different ocean. Now here's a pattern interrupt, because I promised you this gets weirder, and it does. Let's talk about why predator meat tastes different in the first place, because this matters more than you'd think. Herbivore meat, generally speaking, is higher in fat, more tender, and calorically denser. That's partly because herbivores like deer, cattle, and bison spend their energy grazing calmly and building up fat reserves. Predator meat, by contrast, tends to be leaner, tougher, and often described across historical accounts as having a strong, unpleasant, sometimes almost musky flavor. Why? Partly diet. Predators eat meat, and meat-based diets change the composition and flavor of an animal's own muscle tissue in ways that most human palates find genuinely off-putting. Partly lifestyle. Predators are constantly active, chasing prey, defending territory, burning through muscle in ways that make their meat tougher and stringier compared to a calmly grazing herbivore. So even setting aside the toxin risk and the parasite risk, predator meat was often simply a worse calorie for effort trade, and ancient humans were, whether they realized it or not, running a constant cost-benefit calculation. This is actually a real anthropological concept called optimal foraging theory. It basically says that humans and animals instinctively favor food sources that deliver the most calories and nutrition for the least amount of risk and effort. Now apply that lens to hunting a predator. A deer, generally speaking, will run from. A lion will not. A lion might turn around and hunt you back. Which brings us to reason number 3, and honestly, this one is almost too obvious once you hear it. Danger. Hunting an apex predator is genuinely one of the most dangerous things a human being can attempt. These animals are literally built through millions of years of evolution to kill efficiently. Sharp teeth, powerful jaws, claws, speed, strength, and often pack coordination. Compare that to hunting a herd animal like a bison or an antelope. Still dangerous, still difficult, but fundamentally a different category of risk. A wounded deer runs, a wounded lion attacks. So even before you factor in toxic livers or parasites, ancient humans faced an incredibly basic calculation. Is this meat worth risking my life for when there is safer, more abundant, better tasting meat literally grazing in the next field over? For most communities, across most of history, the answer was simply no, not worth it. Leave the predator alone. Hunt the deer instead. There's a striking real-world example of this danger calculation among the Mahsi people of East Africa, who historically did practice lion hunting, but treated it as an extraordinary event, not routine food gathering. Traditionally, hunting a lion was tied to rites of passage for young warriors, a way to demonstrate courage, and it was carried out communal, with strict rules, specific spears, and enormous respect for how dangerous the animal actually was. The lion, even when hunted, was almost never treated as a casual meat source after. The act of hunting it mattered far more than the meat itself, which tells you everything about how differently predators were valued compared to ordinary prey. That's the same underlying logic showing up again in a completely different part of the world. When a predator is dangerous enough, hunting it stops being about food entirely and becomes about proving something else. Status, bravery, rite of passage. The meat becomes almost secondary to the achievement. But here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because it wasn't purely practical. Something else got layered on top of all this risk and biology, something almost spiritual. Across an enormous number of unrelated ancient cultures, predators weren't just avoided as food. They were elevated, respected, sometimes outright worshipped. In ancient Egypt, lions were associated directly with powerful protective deity. The goddess Met was depicted with a lioness head, feared and respected as a force capable of both destruction and protection. You don't casually eat the physical embodiment of a war goddess. In multiple Native American traditions, wolves and bears were regarded as spiritually significant animals, sometimes seen as guides, sometimes as symbols of strength and wisdom, sometimes treated almost as relatives rather than prey. Killing one, let alone eating one, often carried serious ritual weight and specific protocol, not casual hunting. In Aztec culture, the jaguar was one of the most sacred and feared animals in the entire belief system. Elite Aztec warriors, some of the most respected fighters in the empire, were literally organized into an order called the Jaguar Warrior, who wore jaguar pelts into battle to symbolically channel the animal's power. You don't eat the animal you're trying to spiritually become. In parts of ancient China, the tiger represented courage, power, and protection, showing up constantly in art, mythology, and later in traditional medicine, though notably in ways that used specific parts rather than treating the tiger as an everyday food source. Across ancient Rome and Greece, big cats were associated with God, and were sometimes kept, displayed, or used in spectacle, rather than treated as livestock. Notice the pattern here. Culture after culture, completely independently, arrived at the same basic conclusion. Predators are danger. Predators are powerful. Predators deserve respect, fear, or reverence, not a place on the dinner table. This wasn't random superstition. This was, in a very real sense, ancient risk management wrapped in mythology. When you turn an animal into a spiritual symbol, you create a powerful cultural mechanism that discourages people from hunting it casually. Myth became a survival tool, whether anyone consciously designed it that way or not. There's also a fascinating case up in northern Japan and the surrounding region among the Ainu people, where the brown bear held an almost impossibly complicated status. The bear was treated as sacred, as a kind of visiting spirit or deity temporarily wearing an animal's body. And yet, in certain very specific, highly ritualized ceremonies, bear meat actually was eaten, but only as part of an elaborate, sacred ceremony designed to send the bear's spirit back to the spirit world with honor and gratitude. This wasn't casual eating. It wasn't hunting a bear on a random Tuesday for dinner. It was an entire structured cultural system that acknowledged the bear's power and danger by wrapping consumption inside deep ritual meaning, rather than treating it as ordinary food. The taboo didn't mean never touch it. It meant you may only touch it with enormous respect, under very specific conditions, and never casual. That distinction actually shows up again and again across cultures we've already covered. The rule usually wasn't a flat, absolute ban. It was a heavily restricted, heavily ritualized exception to an otherwise strong avoidance pattern, which honestly is an even more sophisticated system than a simple yes or no rule. It's risk management with built-in flexibility for genuine emergencies or genuinely significant ceremony. And here's a detail that might genuinely surprise you. This taboo wasn't universal or absolute. Some cultures did eat predator meat, at least occasionally, and it's worth being honest about that. Certain Arctic and subarctic communities did eat parts of predators predators like wolves and foxes during famine conditions, when survival options were extremely limited. Some historical accounts describe bear meat being eaten in parts of North America and Europe, though often surrounded by specific rituals, restrictions on which parts could be eaten, and sometimes ceremonial apology to the animal's spirit before consumption. This detail matters a lot because it shows something important. The avoidance of predator meat wasn't some rigid universal law carved into human DNA. It was a flexible, learned pattern shaped by risk, biology, and culture that different groups applied with different levels of strictness depending on their specific environment and circumstance. When food was abundant and safer alternatives existed, predator meat mostly got avoided. When survival was genuinely on the line, some of those rules bent, but even then, they often came wrapped in ritual, caution, and specific preparation methods, almost like ancient humans were instinctively trying to manage a risk they couldn't fully explain. Now let's talk about something modern science eventually confirmed that ties this entire story together. Predator populations are naturally much smaller than prey populations for a very basic ecological reason. Energy law. Every time energy moves up one level of a food chain, roughly 90% of it is lost, mostly as heat, through basic biological processes. That means it takes an enormous number of herbivores to support a relatively small number of predators. Practically speaking, this means predator animals were simply rarer, harder to find, and harder to hunt sustainably compared to abundant herbivore population. Even without any concept of ecology, ancient communities that depended on stable, repeatable food sources would have naturally gravitated toward abundant herbivores over scarce, dangerous predators purely through repeated experience. Hunt too many predators, and suddenly there aren't any left to hunt next season. Hunt herbivores instead, and the population replenishes far more easily. This is functionally an early informal version of sustainable resource management, arrived at through necessity rather than any formal ecological theory. So when you stack all of this together, you start to see the real picture. This wasn't one single reason ancient humans avoided eating predators. It was an entire overlapping stack of independently discovered survival knowledge. Toxins concentrated dangerously at the top of the food chain, learned the hard way through generations of poisoning. Parasites accumulated in predator tissue, learned the hard way through generations of sickness. The meat itself was often tougher, leaner, and less rewarding for the effort involved. Hunting apex predators was extraordinarily dangerous, sometimes fatally so, and predator populations were naturally scarce, making them an unreliable, unsustainable food source compared to abundant herbivores. On top of all of that, layered like a final protective seal, many cultures wrapped these practical dangers in spiritual meaning, myth, and taboo, creating powerful cultural mechanisms that reinforced the same lesson across generations long after anyone could remember exactly why the rule started in the first place. Think about how remarkable that actually is. No biology textbook, no understanding of toxicology, parasitology, or trophic ecology. And yet, across isolated cultures with zero contact with each other, humans arrived at a strikingly consistent set of behaviors, all pointing toward the exact same conclusion that modern science would only formally explain thousands of years later. That's not luck. That's the accumulated weight of thousands of years of careful, repeated observation, passed down not through papers or research grants, but through something far simpler and honestly far more impressive. Memory, story, warning, ritual, tradition. A grandmother telling a grandchild, "Don't eat that part, it made your uncle sick." A hunter warning the next generation, "That animal isn't worth the risk." A shaman weaving a story about a sacred jaguar spirit that quietly discourages an entire community from hunting an animal that could easily kill them. None of these people were writing scientific papers, but collectively, across thousands of years and countless unrelated cultures, they built something that functions remarkably like one: a distributed, informal, oral database of survival knowledge, tested and refined through the harshest possible peer review process imaginable. Real consequences in the real world for getting it wrong. There's one more thread worth pulling before we close because it explains something you've probably noticed without ever really thinking about. Notice how almost every single culture we've covered tonight, completely independently, without contact, without shared language, without shared writing systems, landed on some version of the exact same three-part response to dangerous apex predator. Avoid eating them regularly, treat hunting them as high risk and high status, and wrap them in myth, reverence, or outright worship. That triple pattern repeating itself across Egypt, the Arctic, the Americas, China, Japan, Rome, is honestly one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have that this wasn't cultural coincidence. It was convergent survival logic. Different groups of humans faced with the same basic biological and ecological reality independently discovered the same solution. The same way different engineers in different countries working separately sometimes independently invent the same technology because the underlying problem only really has one good solution. Predators sit at the top of the food chain. That position comes with concentrated toxins, concentrated parasites, tougher and less rewarding meat, extreme hunting danger, and naturally low population numbers. Every single culture that survived long enough to leave a lasting historical footprint had to, in some form, arrive at a working answer to that reality. The ones that didn't figure it out simply didn't survive long enough to pass their mistakes on. So next time somebody tells you ancient humans were primitive, or that they just stumbled through history without any real understanding of their world, remember this. They looked at the most dangerous, most powerful animals on the planet, and through nothing but instinct, memory, and hard experience, figured out exactly which parts would kill them, exactly which behaviors would get them mauled, and exactly which stories would keep future generations from making the same mistake twice. They didn't need a microscope to understand bioaccumulation. They didn't need a lab to identify trichinosis. They didn't need an ecology degree to understand that hunting the rarest, most dangerous animal in the entire ecosystem was a losing bet compared to the herd of deer grazing safely nearby. They just needed to pay attention, remember what happened, and pass it on. So the next time you sit down to a meal, and it's beef or chicken or fish, and definitely not lion or wolf or bear liver, understand that you're not just following some random modern preference. You're the living endpoint of tens of thousands of years of quiet, dangerous, hard-won trial and error. Somebody, somewhere, a very long time ago, got violently sick, or worse, so that you wouldn't have to. And honestly, that's a debt worth remembering next time you take a